Alright guys, VLM here back with a new video, and in this video I'm starting a bit of a series here where if you've been following my streams, you would know that over the last few months I have been in the process of watching every English language series of The Amazing Race, to where I've now watched all of Amazing Race Canada, Australia, Asia, and China Rush. And to follow that up, here I'll be starting my series of videos talking about them. And obviously with the Amazing Race Canada Season 8 having just ended a few weeks ago, here I will be starting it off with my season ranking for the Amazing Race Canada, which is a series that as a whole I do like. However, I do obviously have some complaints with it. I do think it is a series that did start off pretty strong, but I think as the series went along, I do think it started to lose some of what made it really great. I do think it started to really lean into this happy-go-lucky nature and trying to be this like summer fun show while also being this extremely patriotic show, to the point where I do see the more modern seasons as kind of lacking from a reality TV standpoint. But I will say that out of the international series that I have watched, I do think Amazing Race Canada as a whole is probably the strongest of that bunch. Even though in reality, I don't think a single season of Amazing Race Canada truly reaches the top tier of Amazing Race seasons in my eyes. I think even the best season here is at best a bottom top tier season of the show, but still gonna be fun to run through every season here. And we do have 8 seasons to rank here. So let's start off at number 8. My least favorite season of the Amazing Race Canada ends up being season 6, the Heroes Edition, which this is just everything I hate about Amazing Race Canada. I think this season really just exemplifies like all of my flaws with the series. Again, to have an entire season filled with heroes is just so boring. Really, I think this cast is one of the worst casts of any Amazing Race season I've watched, especially when we're going. I think this is one of the worst casts I've ever watched on Amazing Race, and a lot of that's because all of them are just so happy-go-lucky. They're all not very confrontational people. There's no drama across this entire season, which really the lack of drama is just a complaint with a lot of modern Amazing Race. But again, this season is just so heavy-handed with the constant talk of what does it mean to be a hero? And really just a lot of these teams are just super boring. I mean, Dylan and Kiwami, who are these people? They make it to the very end. I don't know who they are. Taylor and Courtney, the most dominant team on this season. Again, also, know very little about them. They just feel extremely generic. Nancy and Melissa and Leanna Marr, both of them pretty competent female teams. I just feel like they blend in with a lot of the other strong-ish female teams across the Amazing Race Canada. Zainab and Monica are one of the most boring teams in the history of the show. Todd and Anna probably had the most blatant like shock elimination in the history of the show, where it felt so clear they were being set up for a fall pretty early on. Now I will say I did really like Phil and Martina. I did feel like Martina, it was just such a ridiculous character that was kind of fun. And I will say I do kind of like the story of Courtney and Adam, where while they are terrible winners from a race perspective, with them coming second to last for about half of the race and not winning a leg until the final one, I do still find their story to be really interesting here. And I think if there was any outcome to make this season not an absolute dreadful experience, it was their win. But again, it's not enough to save the season for me, and it does still end up being my least favorite season of the show. Next up, moving on to number 7, and here we actually have the most recent season of the show. We have the Amazing Race Canada 8. And I will say, for me, this and the next season are a big debate. I do feel like this is a season that probably has a better cast. I do think it has a more likable group of people. However, I also feel like there are a lot of negatives that come along with that as well. Obviously, this is the first and only season so far to be filmed post the COVID outbreak, and with that comes some very questionable production decisions. Like, obviously, 3 teams end up getting COVID mid-race and end up getting pulled out for a few legs. But despite them coming back, the format of the season is not accommodated for that, strangely, to where because of all this and us having teams come back when the teams are taken out due to COVID, there isn't a team eliminated until episode 5, which is just ridiculous. And then following that, despite them being off schedule, they still decide to have non-elimination legs, leading to us still needing a double elimination along the way and still ending up with the final 4 in the final leg, which is such a bizarre structure to me. And it really made this season feel like the season that was never going to end. I feel like a lot of the middle stretch of this season just really dragged on due to this. But again, I do think as a whole, this is a decent cast. I do think there are teams here that do stand out from the likes of the winners and Catherine and Craig, which I know some people were not happy with their win. However, I do feel like they are a pretty notable team and one that, again, has a really good story to a win, so I'll give them credit there. I did find it interesting how focused this season was on strategy, to where it did feel like there were a lot of alliances going around, and Frenella seemed to be at the center of that. And I will say, I personally was thinking that Frenella was going to win for a lot of the season, so for them to fall short was also an interesting note to me. But we also had their rivalry with Beverly and Veronica, which was really the only source of drama across this entire season, but at least it existed. And I do think it led to a pretty strong episode, where for me, the strongest episode of the entire season was the double elimination, where Frenella used the pass on Beverly and Veronica, which the pass is a really lame twist, but yeah, it really highlighted the Frenella Beverly Veronica feud there. I really like Cedric, Ty's father, who Ty from Big Brother Canada 9 was on this season, to where, again, like, I thought they had a fun dynamic. I thought Cedric was a lot of fun, though, I mean, they kind of sucked at the race. Brendan and Connor felt like the very generic, goofy, young guy sort of dynamic that they go for, at least, but they were fun here as well. And really, again, like, I think it's a very mixed season for me. I do think the end of the season was probably stronger than the middle portion of the season that really dragged on, especially the period where we were like kind of unsure of what exactly they were doing in relation to COVID, where again, teams were taken out, teams were put back in, no one was getting eliminated. Like, it really just felt like this season had no direction for a lot of it, but I do think it ends up being a solid enough season. But those flaws do leave it here at number 7. Now, number 6, we're moving on to a season that I believe is looked at as one of the worst seasons. And I do agree, it is not a great season. However, again, for me, again, it's a step above The Amazing Race Canada 8, and that is The Amazing Race Canada 3. And again, like, I think this is a season that's harmed by its kind of mediocre cast. I do think there are a lot of teams on this season that are simply unnotable or really just not super likable. It's also the biggest season of the show, to where it does have a 12-team cast, the largest cast, while also having 12 legs, which, to be fair, season 2 did as well. But actually, that's something that I do kind of consider a pro here, in the fact that that does mean that there are less non-elimination legs. There are only 2 across the entire season. But again, the issue with this season for me is the fact that, again, there are some pretty unnotable teams. I mean, teams like Brian and Cynthia and Neil and Kirsten, and probably the biggest offenders of them all, the final 2 in Gino and Jesse and Nick and Matt, who a lot of the endgame stretch of the season revolves around their rivalry. However, the issue is that both of them are really boring teams. So the fact that their rivalry ends up being the main storyline of the entire season ends up being an underwhelming element of the season. But again, despite that, I do feel like there are other pretty interesting teams. I mean, I do find Brent and Sean likable. I do like Cindy and Opie, even though they're not the most dynamic team. Dejan and Leilani are a pretty likable team, being the fun bickering couple of the season. I thought Hamilton and Michaela were an interesting team as well, obviously giving us the first transgender participant in The Amazing Race. And also, that gives us pretty much like a better version of the Todd and Anna elimination, of them being the shock early elimination here. But I also found Nick and Sabrina really entertaining as well. So again, it's not a completely dull season as a whole, but I think the thing that does knock it down is the fact that it is a season dominated by 2 of the more boring figures of the season that do end up dominating the airtime of the season. With me pointing out Gino and Jesse as the obvious winners right away from the premiere, I do think it leads to an underwhelming outcome. But again, I think it is a season that as a whole I probably like more than most people, but it's still not a great one. It's here number 6. Now, number 5, we're moving on to probably the most middling season of The Amazing Race Canada to me, where again, the first 3 that we talked about are seasons that I would consider pretty bad to mediocre seasons. I think this is a very average season, and that ends up being The Amazing Race Canada 7, which I do have a lot of the same complaints with this season that I do with a lot of the other modern seasons of The Amazing Race, where again, it does continue that summer fun, happy-go-lucky feel. However, I do think a major pro for this season is Dave and Arena, who are all-time great villains here, and I do think through their villainy, they end up finally adding drama back to the show that had been pretty void throughout a lot of the modern Amazing Race era. Again, I do feel like they were such great characters there, and their rivalry with Arathi and Tanesh was really fun, where again, we actually see them arguing in the airport. I feel like that's something you rarely see, an actual true argument in Amazing Race nowadays. And I do think their elimination comes off as a massive surprise to me, where even coming into the season, I knew about Dave and Arena. However, I always assumed that they lost in the final leg, so to see them come in fourth was a big surprise. But beyond them, we do also get the likes of Lauren and Joanne, who I think have a fun underdog run across the season. We get the return of Jet and Dave, who obviously were the fan favorites of the first season, and see them come back for this season just to be the first out after having a really strong leg, only to get lost to a ridiculous degree on the way to the pit stop, was just so humorous and a great way to start off the season there. I did find the winners in Anthony and James be a really likable team, and while again their race as a whole was just kind of middling, I do feel like them winning here was a pretty satisfying outcome for the season. And really just overall, again, I just feel like this is a very average season of The Amazing Race. I feel like, again, it still has the minor complaints that I have with the entire series as a whole, but I do think as a whole, it is a consistently solid season from beginning to end. I don't think there's really ever a true slow point across the season, but it doesn't really reach that major of highs outside of the Dave and Arena storyline. But because of that, for me, it is better than that bottom tier of the show, and because that lands here number 5. Now number 4, and from this point on, again, I think these are all pretty good seasons of The Amazing Race. However, at number 4, I think I'm going to go with The Amazing Race Canada 4, which is a season that I actually expected to like a lot more coming into it. It is a season that I had actually watched bits and pieces of before coming into the season. Again, I knew very little about The Amazing Race Canada coming into this rewatch. However, obviously Jillian and Emmett are on this season from BB Can and end up having a pretty notable run across this season, to where I had watched clips of this season in the past. I did know that Steph and Kirsten were the winners of this season, and watching it through here, again, it is a very solid season of The Amazing Race. It is a pretty solid cast. Again, Jillian and Emmett are really great TV here, specifically Jillian, where we didn't really see this side of Jillian on Big Brother. This extremely alpha control freak sort of personality, and to see that on The Amazing Race here was pretty fun. You got some likable teams. I liked Frankie and Amy. I liked Kelly and Kate. I thought the first episode in particular was really interesting, where we see Kelly and Kate and Anthony and Brandon both take the penalty, and that ends up being an underwhelming outcome for Anthony and Brandon there. Steph and Kirsten, again, are really strong winners here. One of the most dominant teams in the history of Amazing Race, and I think debatably the strongest team in all of Amazing Race Canada, where they do end up having the same average as Sam and Paul, and are slightly lower than that of Natalie and Megan. However, something to account for is that the only leg that they're not in the top 3 ends up coming from leg 2, which was a leg that they went out of their way to get the express pass they never end up using, and still end up being in 6th there, to where they were top 2 before that. So when you take that into account, they are almost assuredly the best team in The Amazing Race Canada, and see that come from a female-female team is obviously extremely rare in Amazing Race, and I do think that is an interesting aspect of this season as well. Again, I think this is overall a very strong season of the show. I did like seeing this battle between Jillian, Emmett, and Steph and Kirsten. Again, Jillian and Emmett really made the season to me, where again, I thought it would be just because of the BB Can connection, but Jillian is legitimately one of the best characters in all The Amazing Race Canada here, and again, it is just overall a very strong, consistent season. However, I do feel like there are other seasons that probably have higher highs than this one, so because I did leave it here at number 4. At number 3 is a season that I did debate on putting higher, mainly because I think this is probably my favorite cast in all of The Amazing Race Canada. However, I think when we look at the results of the season and how certain storylines played out, I do think it is probably a step below the top 2. And at number 3, we do have The Amazing Race Canada 5. And again, I think this is an all-time great cast of the show. I don't think there's a single dud on this entire cast here. I think maybe you could say Zed and Shabir are just fine, but I do feel like every other team brought something to the table. Mind you, I do think the winners in Sam and Paul are probably the most boring team of the entire season, but it is their extreme dominance over the race that does leave them somewhat interesting. Again, they have a really insane end stretch to the season where, like, coming into leg 7, they were like a good team, but then they just simply dominate the final 5 legs, winning all 5 legs there and ending up with a 2.0 average, the exact same average as Steph and Kirsten, which is like a really insane stat there. But even beyond that, I thought Kenneth and Ryan were a really fun team, which also, rest in peace, Kenneth. But I think they are like the epitome of these like goofy young guy sort of duos. Corey and Ivana end up having a really fun underdog run of having 6 second to last finishes across the season. I just felt like their dynamic across the season was also just really fun. I thought Karen and Bert were an interesting team, despite being this like very middling team that never really placed too highly. I thought they ended up being likable. Adam and Andrea and Ebony were good teams as well. Megan and Courtney, I thought, had a really fun downfall of them just for some reason not deciding to use the Express Pass. And the very early boots in Dan and Rhea and Aaron and Deb were very notable in their own rights as well. So again, I think this is overall a very strong cast. However, again, in terms of results, I do think that is what leaves it below the top 2, where again, we do have this complete domination from Sam and Paul throughout a lot of the season that just wasn't that interesting to watch, particularly from, again, them not being the most interesting team in the world. But still a very solid season of the show, and it lands here number 3. Now number 2, and if you've not paid attention, the top 2 end up being the first 2 seasons of the show, which, as I mentioned, again, like, I just think the show was a lot stronger during its first few seasons. That, for me, season 5 was kind of the transition point where I think season 5 kind of had these elements of the show that I didn't particularly like, but then I feel like they go all in on it after season 5. But again, for me, first 2 seasons really just feel like your typical Amazing Race seasons. I don't feel like they have the typical flaws of the modern Amazing Race Canada seasons, outside of like maybe like some random segments about patriotism. But again, both still really strong seasons. The question is the order, and at number 2, I do have The Amazing Race Canada 2. And I think this is a season that has grown on me as time has gone on. I'll be honest, when I actually watched it, I thought it was good, but I didn't have it in as high regard as I do now. I do think it's a season that felt like a step down from season 1 to a degree, but after watching the rest of the series and thinking back on the series, I do think it is the number 2 pick here. Again, like, I do think there was an argument for season 5 being higher, just because I found season 5's cast as a whole to be more likable. But season 2's cast is not bad either. I mean, it is a very strong cast here. I think an issue here is another one of these situations where the more entertaining teams don't get to the end. I mean, at the final 3, we're left with Mikey and Pete, who are like probably the worst of these goofy bro sort of pairs. We have Natalie and Megan, who are an extremely dominant female team, one of the highest averages in the history of the Amazing Race, but also kind of boring. And then we have Ryan and Rob, who are like one of these teams that have this underdog run of being second to last or even last for a lot of the race. I mean, literally for over half of the race, they are at best second to last, but really outside of that, I mean, they're kind of boring as well. However, when you get away from that, I do think a lot of the teams that get taken out in the middle are really strong. I love Suki and Jinder. Again, really fun characters there. Elaine and Audrey were the fun bickering couple of the season. Pierre and Mikkel were these like fun villainous figures that had a fun downfall. Rex and Bob, I think, were kind of like the Canadian version of Team Guido, and I think came off as fun. Cormac and Nicole, I thought, were a likable mother-son team there. Again, I think those stretch of teams there are really, really strong. It's just that I think the early boots are not particularly memorable, and then also the people that make it to the final leg are also not particularly entertaining. But again, the run of Natalie and Megan is really great here. And really historic run there. Even though, again, I think technically I would probably say Steph and Kirsten are the better team, even though Natalie and Megan have the better average. But again, like, we have an all-time great episode in the France leg where Pierre and Mikkel backstab Elaine and Audrey by U-turning them, only for them to proceed to go home because they suck at the Mentos roadblock, which they get stuck at for almost 8 hours. And again, that's a really fun storyline there. And again, like, as a whole, it is a very strong, consistent season with a lot of notable storylines and individual moments. And I can definitely see the argument for this technically being the best season of The Amazing Race Canada, but for me, I feel like I clicked with the other season a bit more, and because that's here at number 2. Now, number 1, the number 1 season of The Amazing Race Canada, to me, ends up being The Amazing Race Canada Season 1. And really, I think the way to sum up this season is really just the term train wreck. Like, this is such a train wrecky season from beginning to end, and it's really just hilarious how this season plays out. Where, I mean, it does get like a bit of a slower start. I mean, the boots of Trina and Danielle and Jamie and Pierre are kind of predictable there, but following that, we get a string of, by the time of the final 7, the 4 strongest teams coming into that final 7 end up being taken out one by one, to where we lose Kirsten and Darren, who are a really consistent team up until their elimination. We have Hal and Joanne, who go out in one of the best episodes in all of Amazing Race in my eyes, but they had been a really strong team beforehand. But we see the Tims U-turn them, and they end up U-turning Holly and Brett, and it ends up being a battle between the two, the who stays, and that was really fun. Holly and Brett end up being really fun villains across the season, where, while they aren't that different from many other villains I feel like I've seen now across all the international seasons, I feel like to start off Amazing Race Canada here, I feel like they came off as pretty notable. And you have Jen and Dave, who are like the original fan favorites of the Amazing Race Canada, this really fun, again, goofy bro team that, again, starts off a bit rocky, but they end up having a really strong stretch in the middle, only for them to barely miss out on the final leg. And again, those are the 4 strongest teams of the season that were all booted one after the other. And coming into the final leg, we're left with really a group of misfits, where we have Vanessa and Selena, who were really largely mediocre across most of the race, but just somehow make it to the final leg. You have Jody and Corey, who were largely mediocre until the halfway point in the race, and all of a sudden just win 3 legs in a row. But I will say that they are probably one of the more boring teams of the entire season. And then we got the winners in Tim and Tim, who have one of the funniest leads up to a win that I've ever seen here. I love how they literally got saved by 2 non-elimination legs, barely survived the penultimate leg, make major mistakes in the final leg, and still end up winning the season. And really just the final leg in general was just so much fun to watch, with every single team making mistakes there. And again, we have the Tims get lost looking for a clue that, despite being in first, they end up coming out of that section in last, only from the win due to the final task. Again, really fun train wrecky win there. And again, as a whole, this is a pretty strong season. To me, this very much feels like an old school Amazing Race season, where while there, again, is some Canada propaganda along the way, and this is a season that is entirely contained in Canada, which can also come up as underwhelming, I do think outside that, this does just feel like a traditional Amazing Race season in the way that it is portrayed here. I think it's not trying to go out of its way to make every team super likable like it feels like the modern Amazing Race does, and mixing that in with the train wrecky nature of the season and it having these really humorous winners to bat. For me, this is by far the best season of the Amazing Race Canada, and because of that, it's here number 1. But there we go. I mean, that is my ranking of every season of Amazing Race Canada. Now, moving forward, again, I will be continuing this series where next up will be the Amazing Race Australia, which hopefully that season ranking will be coming out soon. Also, again, I did watch Asia and China Rush, where, again, I will be doing a season ranking on Asia and really just a broader video on Amazing Race China Rush. Those will be for further down the road, probably, just because I feel like there are a lot more time-sensitive videos that need to come out a bit sooner, but again, those will come out eventually. Also, we obviously have the Amazing Race 34 currently going on, and I will be doing a review of that once that finishes. And obviously, we got Survivor 43 going on, so expect coverage of that as well. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.